Tamar Ish Shalom, and this is Jewish Crossroads. Today, I'm really happy to welcome Matti Friedman, a renowned author, journalist, and former Associated Press correspondent in Jerusalem, and also a dear friend. Shalom, Matti.
Hi, Tamar.
Matti has written for the New York Times, Atlantic, the Free Press, and other major outlets, and is the author of several widely read books on Israel, war, and Jewish identity. What makes his voice so distinctive is a rare combination, an intimate understanding of Israeli society, paired with the clear, curious eye of someone who wasn't born into it, but chose it. He made Aliyah from Canada at the age of 17. And that position, I think, both inside and slightly outside, gives his writing a depth and honesty that's hard to find. His new book, Out of the Sky, will be published very soon. We will talk about that as well. Toda for being with us, Matti. How are you these days?
As we always say in Israel, בהתאם לנסיבות, in keeping with the circumstances, about as good as possible.
You know that there's a famous saying that Israelis love Aliyah, but love Olim a little less, meaning that we love the idea of Jews immigrating to Israel, but we don't always welcome them with open hands and hearts. Can you share with us, your own Aliyah experience, what brought you to Israel, how it felt to be an Oleh Chadash, a newcomer, and looking back, do you think that that saying is true?
I have to say that my experience was very good. I arrived when I was 17 years old. This was 1995. I thought I was an adult at the time. So a few years ago, someone who was describing me said that I came to Israel as a kid. And I corrected them. I said I wasn't a kid. But now my kids are older than 17, and I still think that they're kids. So of course I was very young. I don't know what I expected. I didn't expect to be, I didn't expect to see the red carpet, but I landed on a small kibbutz, a religious kibbutz on Mount Gilboa, so about 2 hours north of Jerusalem.
Ma'ale Gilboa.
Ma'ale Gilboa, overlooking the Beit She'an Valley. And this was it was less than 30 families. At the time, it was kind of a failing kibbutz. And I milked cows, and it was the most wonderful place in the world. I couldn't have imagined anything better than waking up at 4:30 a.m. and milking the cows. And I was part of the team in the dairy barn, and people on the kibbutz treated me wonderfully. They were, I think, just happy that someone came. There was almost no one on this kibbutz, and the kids on the kibbutz had very few peers, so they were happy that someone showed up. So my Aliyah experience was very positive, and I'm sure that that's a big part of why I stayed and why my life took the course that it did. In retrospect, I also had a funny experience of being part of the Great Aliyah of the 1990s, which you remember because you were here. The Great Aliyah of the 1990s involves 1 million Russians. In the army, there would be special programs for Olim, or there'd be, when I would go to the absorption ministry to arrange my rights as an Ole, it was me and Russian speakers. And that's, I think, also why I have an affinity for that Aliyah. I love the Russian segment of the Israeli population, and I kind of see myself as an honorary Russian just because being an Ole in the 90s means that you are Russian. So I feel kind of Russian, and Aliyah in Israel, of course, is a very common experience. So it's not like there are, 3 or 4 immigrants in this country. A big part of the country is Olim, and Israel has this special status for immigrants, which is hinted at in that word. We don't even call them immigrants. You don't call people who move to Israel mehagrim. Yeah. That would be a demeaning word because the Zionist movement creates this other vocabulary for what's happening when you move to Israel, and that word is aliyah, which means literally ascent. So this is a word that kind of gives nobility to what in other countries is just a technical move. We are those who ascend. So, all in all, my experience could have been much worse than it was.
Mm-hmm. You've lived most of your life in Israel. Do you remember a moment when you felt this is it? I mean, I feel Israeli now. Is there even such a moment?
I remember one moment. This was about almost a year after I arrived on this kibbutz, and I had learned Hebrew. I had some very basic Hebrew when I came, and I desperately wanted to be friends with other young people on the kibbutz. And I still remember the first time that I said something funny in Hebrew on purpose. I probably said a lot of things in Hebrew that were funny in Hebrew, not on purpose. Most of the time, I guess the people around me were polite enough not to laugh. But I remember the first time that I told a joke in Hebrew, and two girls from the kibbutz. I was driving a kind of tractor called a front end loader. It's like a tractor with a shovel in the front, and I was driving it in the dairy, in the area of the dairy barn, and there were two kibbutznikiyot on the tractor with me, and I said something funny on purpose, and they laughed. And I still remember that moment. It must have been a very significant one for me.
You know, I'm still waiting for that moment in English, because humor is such a barrier, right? In second languages that you acquire. Well, with less humor, to the next question, we're seeing a global rise in anti-Semitism on both the right and the left since October 7th. And still, every country has like its own story. Do you think there's something distinctive about the anti-Semitism we're seeing in Canada? And how painful is it for you to watch this happening in the country where you were born and raised?
So I'm always suspicious of any events being described from afar, because my experience as an Israeli has been that events in this country are completely distorted as they're reported for foreign audiences. So I'm very cautious when I see a lot of panic about protests or anti-Semitic events in other countries. My initial response is skepticism, which is, I'm sure not always the right response, or often the wrong response. But because I'm so skeptical of news coverage about Israel, that makes me skeptical about everything. And I try to remind myself that the human tendency is to be skeptical about things we don't want to believe, and very credulous about things that we do want to believe. And so I'm cautious, and I think that some of the panic is probably just that, panic. However, I know enough about the city that I'm from, Toronto, and about the country that I'm from, which is Canada, to know that something real is going on. Their life has changed for Jews in Canada. I think if we look at a place like France, we've seen these processes continue over the past 20 and 30 years to such an extent that my neighborhood in South Jerusalem, I'm speaking to you from a neighborhood called Arnona in South Jerusalem, and this part of South Jerusalem has become, over the past 10 or 15 years, very French. And it's become very French because many French Jews have felt that they need to leave France because of a threat that comes often from Muslim immigrants to France, and that is insufficiently addressed by French authorities, and that is actually amplified by left-wing ideology and by this confluence of ideologies that we're seeing on the left, where causes of interest to Islamist elements are also adopted by progressives who you would think would have very little sympathy for religious conservatives, but that seems to be not true in that case, and that is a very potent force in the lives of the Jews of France. So we've seen things progress very far, and if you know any French Jews, they will confirm what I'm saying. So we've seen it go quite far in France. The UK is not quite where France is, but it's also quite far along that road. And if you've spoken to British Jews recently, you'll hear something very close to panic. And a lot of people are talking about exit strategies. 2 Jews were murdered at a synagogue in Manchester not long ago. There have been mass protests, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets in London and other cities. And those are just 2 examples. There are many more examples of vandalism and harassment and a real change in the atmosphere. I would say that Canada is behind the UK in that process, but ahead of the United States. So I think things are still better in the United States than they are in Canada, better in Canada than they are in the UK, and better in the UK than they are in France. But we can see the same process unfolding, which is this process where Jews who'd considered themselves to be at home in the liberal democracies of the West are gradually waking up to the fact that they may not be. That demography has changed and political culture has changed, and these incredibly poisonous stories about Israel are being used against them under the camouflage of an anti-Zionist political critique. So if 20 years you couldn't really go after a Jewish community by saying, using the old tropes like global finance or the Rothschilds or the old stories about Jewish bankers, and today you can go after Jewish communities because you can say that they're supporters of genocide, and if you support genocide, then any attack on you is justified. And this has been very ably deployed against Jews across the West. So the short answer to your question is that I'm very concerned, and I've been shocked by the pictures that I've seen from cities like Toronto and Montreal. The Toronto that I grew up in was a city of incredible tolerance, and I grew up going to public school. So I went to a public high school but I wore a kippah. So I was identifiably Jewish, and I had an experience which is pretty rare for a white person, which is that I was a member of an identifiable minority. And I had pretty close to zero problems. My experience was a really good one, and my friends weren't Jewish. And I would never have had doubts about the acceptance of Jews in Canadian society. And now we're seeing something very, very different. We're seeing a real turn in the climate on the streets. We're seeing an unwillingness on the part of law enforcement to address this. And we're seeing Jewish people really wondering about their place in the world that they thought was safe.
You know, there's been a very intense internal debate lately within the American Jewish community about how to respond to anti-Semitism, and two events from just the past few weeks really intersected. One was a speech by journalist Bret Stephens, where he argued, broadly speaking, that organizations like the ADL could even be dismantled, and that we should stop focusing so much on fighting anti-Semitism by trying to persuade anti-Semites with data and stories. First, he says, because we're a tiny minority and it's a losing battle. And second, because anti-Semitism isn't rational belief anyway. So pointing out Jewish contributions, to humanity will not change how they look at the world. And at the same time, during the Super Bowl, there was an anti-Semitism commercial funded by businessman Robert Kraft, which sparked a wide debate between enthusiastic supporters of the ad and those who argued that Jews should stop placing themselves in the position of victims, which is, it sounds like what Bret Stephens is arguing. So where do you stand in this debate?
I think that clearly Jewish communities need to put resources into legal defense. So if you're a student at a university and you're being harassed by a professor, or if you're being discriminated against by an administrator, or if you're, worried about a turn in the curriculum of your public school, I think that there should be legal ways to address that. Anyone who harasses Jewish people or discriminates against Jewish people should face legal consequences for that. And I think that resources put in that direction are well spent. But I essentially agree very much with what Bret Stephens said, and I've been saying it for a long time. A lot of people come to me or ask me about this because I've written about this problem ever since I addressed what I saw at the Associated Press in a few essays about 10 years ago. So people have kind of come to me and have asked, what do I think that they should do about this? And I think that the answer that people are expecting is, let's take $1 million, $10 million and put it into fighting this war for the narrative, or a war for consciousness. And I have to tell them that I think that money is just money wasted. I think it's being flushed down the toilet. I think that Jewish communities have wasted incredible amounts of money trying to fight something that can't be fought. I think that, public opinion when it takes this turn can't really be shifted. I think that if we had 100 amazing spokeswomen educated at Oxford making our case on every possible television channel, it wouldn't matter, because the obsession with Jews or with Israel, it's not really about the subject of the obsession. A psychiatrist will tell you that in the case of an obsession, the subject of the obsession is almost irrelevant. It's about something that's going on in the mind of the person who's obsessed. So these are processes that we've seen in the past many times, unfortunately. And I think that the idea that we can change them if we can just, get enough reporters on a trip to Israel, if I can just get through to the editor of the New York Times, if I can just, get the right commercial shown to enough people at the Super Bowl, this is really barking up the wrong tree. I wish that it could have an effect. I'm not denying the problem. I'm just saying there are things you can fight in life, and there are things that you can't. I think what we can do is educate ourselves better. I think this crisis is catching a lot of Jewish people at a moment of intense ignorance about Judaism, and that's not a coincidence. I think a lot of Jewish people, not just in the diaspora, by the way, but also in Israel, but we're talking about the diaspora, don't have basic Jewish literacy. People do not speak Hebrew. A lot of people are being attacked for being Jewish, but don't know what that is, and they haven't seen the richness of Jewish life, and they don't understand Judaism as a kind of civilization, which is one of the wisest civilizations in the history of the world. They don't have access to that. So they're being hammered with this political stuff, and they have nothing to fall back on. And you can really see the difference in the way, Orthodox communities are responding to this, and the way liberal communities or unaffiliated Jews are responding to it. It hits much harder if you don't have the anchor. So one thing we can do with these resources is try to educate people better. Jewish education is very expensive. It doesn't need to be if communities decide that this is a priority. And I think that is not going to make the problem go away, just to be clear. That's not going to make the problem go away. It will just make it easier to deal with for people who want to remain, inside Judaism, which I hope will be more people. Sometimes in this kind of crisis, people are driven back into the fold of the community, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's the circumstances in which it's happening are tragic, but we're seeing a rise in people attending synagogue, and we're seeing a rise in communal affiliation because people are sensing a kind of hostility that wasn't there before. But here, when I think about what to do about this this kind of problem, I really do draw inspiration from our friend Theodor Herzl, our colleague that who we spoke about in Jerusalem a few years ago. Because Herzl, if you read Herzl's story, there's an amazing book about this called Herzl by Amos Elon, which we spoke about on stage. I'm still recommend, just as like I recommend
I highly recommend it to anyone that hasn't read it yet.
It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And if you read about Herzl in Vienna in the 1890s, it sounds incredibly current. I mean, it sounds like now he lives in a cosmopolitan city. He thinks that assimilation is a matter of time. He has a Christmas tree in his house, and his son isn't circumcised. And the path is clear to Herzl. And he's a reporter for the New York Times, basically, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then things change, and suddenly people are seeing Jews in a different light. Just kind of like the shift that people have sensed in the past couple of years. Things change for Herzl and for his family and for his upper class circles. And he does something really remarkable, which is not to run around Vienna and beg people to be nice to the Jews. And he doesn't start a campaign against anti-Semitism. And he doesn't, direct. He's a playwright, but he doesn't direct a commercial to be shown at the Austro-Hungarian Super Bowl, begging people to be nice to Jews or hoping that some non-Jewish person will come to the defense of a helpless Jewish kid in school. I mean, all of this would have been anathema to Herzl. He sits down in a hotel room in Paris, and he writes a crazy pamphlet, which, if you read it in the context of its time, I mean, it's nuts. And it's called The Jewish State. And I'm literally sitting in it right now. And Herzl demonstrates the kind of response that's needed. He's not staking his life on the acceptance of his neighbors. He has a different plan. He understands that this problem is extreme and needs to be addressed with extreme measures. And this is his plan. We're going to go somewhere else and have our own state. And it works. In one of the most remarkable twists of history, it works. So when I think about what Zionism is, it's the opposite of a commercial at the Super Bowl. It's the opposite of begging people to be nice to us. It's the opposite of seeing ourselves as victims, which I think, even if it's true, is really poisonous and counterproductive. The answer to this is Zionism. It's the answer that Herzl gave all those years ago. And the events of the past couple of years have only shown me how right those people were, not just Herzl, but his successors, people like Ben Gurion and Katzenelson and Golda, and they understood something deep about the world, and they created a solution that has not made the problems go away, but they have allowed us to live, or some of us to live buffered from it in a Jewish state. And I think that is a better response than many of the other responses that are being floated.
Well, you just spoke about the journalist Theodor Herzl. I want to talk about another great journalist, which is Matti Friedman. And you referred to your article in 2014. I think it was published on Tablet, and then there was another one on the Atlantic. It went viral. It was just after Tzuk Eitan war, and you argued that Israel is covered totally different than other countries, and that the media, in that unique focus on Israel, becomes an active player in shaping events. And it really feels like you saw this pattern a decade before many others. How do you analyze the international media coverage of the current war in light of that article you wrote a decade ago?
I think that the coverage of the current war surprised me a lot less than other people, simply because I saw this happen years before. I was a correspondent for the AP in Jerusalem between 2006 and the very end of 2011. So I didn't have the experience that I was expecting. Let's just put it that way. I'm an Israeli of the, I would say, center left, whatever that means these days, but I didn't expect to have political problems at an American news agency, and I did. And this could be a conversation that could last several hours, but I'll say that what I found was that the key roles in the news apparatus had been taken over by people who were no longer interested in explanatory journalism. They were activists. They were interested in presenting information that was not designed to explain a complicated place to foreign readers. They were designed to mobilize people toward a certain political conclusion. And at the time, I thought this was just a problem with the Israel coverage. So if you read those essays that I published at the time in Tablet and The Atlantic, you'll see that I'm very preoccupied with the way Israel is covered. From 2026, it's obvious that this has affected many different areas of coverage, maybe all areas of coverage, American politics and gender and the environment. And I mean, there are many, many, many examples, but the story about Israel was being warped by the demands of left-wing politics, essentially. And the process that I saw take over the mainstream press at that time was also happening in the big NGO, in the world of big NGOs, the human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, which had gone from being basically trustworthy advocates for human rights to being essentially megaphones for the hard left. And of course, it had happened already in the academy, in big parts of the academy, particularly in the elite academy, as we've now seen at places like Columbia and Harvard. So now it's obvious, but for insiders, it was obvious 15 years ago and certainly 10 years ago. So things that people think happened after October 7th actually happened long before. The machinery of condemnation that we've seen in action around Israel since October 7th was put in place long before October 7th, so that you'd have activists who call themselves journalists quoting activists who call themselves human rights experts, who are quoting activists who call themselves Middle East studies professors, and then they quote Israelis who are part of the international, anti-Israel campaign, and it has created really a perfect storm of information, which is almost, I don't want to say impossible to fight, but very, very hard to fight, because people are just getting hammered with this stuff from so many different directions, from organizations that they deem to be credible, that someone like me has to do a lot of explaining before I can get even an intelligent and well-read Western person to suspect that the information they're getting is incorrect. So
everything he perceives is through these lenses for decades that he has been given by international media, which is, as you argue, they're trying to shape the narrative, not to, give the reader the facts.
Correct. I mean, I'll just give you a kind of a broad example, the idea that this is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So in the West, that's the framing in which it's discussed. Every single day at the AP Bureau, we wrote a story that was called Israelis, Palestinians. That's what it was called in the internal coding of the AP. The short form for that was IS-PALS. So we just hammered every day the idea that the conflict that Israel is engaged in is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that is the way that everyone thinks about it. So in that framing, Israelis are more numerous and more westernized and more militarized and more prosperous, and Palestinians are much less so. And if you believe that that's true, then all of the conclusions that you draw about the conflict are going to stem from that framing, and they're going to be mostly wrong because, of course, as we know, Israel's real conflict is with hundreds of millions of people in the Islamic world who have been trying to destroy Israel for the past 100 years, and most of Israel's wars have not been fought against Palestinians. Israel's had to fight wars against Egyptians and Syrians and Lebanese and Iraqis and Jordanians, and our primary concern in the past 30 years has been Iranians, and none of those actors are Palestinians. So clearly there is a broader regional conflict going on, which is not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if you know that, then the past 2.5 years makes sense. And if you think it's just about the Palestinians, then nothing about the past 2.5 years makes sense. So that's just an example of a way you can really flip people's awareness of an issue simply by framing it in a different way. So I'm not even getting into the manipulation of certain facts, or, is the Gaza Health Ministry a reliable source for casualty statistics, or is the Israeli government a reliable source? Before I get into the nitty gritty of how to choose which facts you believe, just the very fact that people think that this is a conflict between strong Israelis and weak Palestinians makes it impossible to understand, and that is on purpose. That's done on purpose in order to drive people to the correct political conclusion. However, if you use that story to actually try to understand what's going on here, you won't get anywhere because it doesn't actually explain anything.
Oh, that's a fascinating example. So, okay, we talked about anti-Semites. We talked about international media. Let's look inwards in our own words. You recently wrote an article for the Free Press titled "Israel Had a Disorienting 2025. What Comes Next?" And we'll get to, where Israel's headed this moment. But first, let's talk about what Israelis actually lived through in 2025, in the past year. You described the central emotion of Israelis in 2025 as vertigo. Can you walk me through that observation?
My vertigo is so bad that I don't even know how to answer your question about what happened in 2025 because I literally can't remember. And when I had to write that article for the Free Press, it was kind of a end of year. They asked me to kind of sum up the year. And after I got that email, I just kind of stared at the ceiling for an hour because I could not remember. I mean, so much happened in 2025, let alone 2024. Let alone since October 7th, that I literally could not remember the events of the year. I mean, was the hostage release where Eli Sharabi came home, was that in 2025? Was it in 2024? When did that war with Iran happen? Was that in June or was it in January? I mean, this pace of events here has been so staggering that it's really, really hard to keep anything straight. And I had this moment of almost literal vertigo, not metaphorical vertigo when I was walking in Jerusalem near the prime minister's house on the sidewalk. I walk there all the time. It's it's a place that I pass a few times a week. And this was a couple months ago, and I'm walking on the sidewalk and I suddenly feel completely disoriented and I don't know where I am. And I'm looking around, I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And I realized that the hostage protest tent, which was erected immediately after October 7th, and which has been a city landmark for the past 2.5 years, that it was kind of this makeshift tent that took up most of the sidewalk, and it was covered with posters of hostages, and there'd be hostage families there, sometimes standing on the road holding signs. I even spent a few hours once holding a sign there, and it was gone. And it was gone as if it had never existed. The sidewalk had been swept. Obviously, the municipal crews had come and cleaned everything up, and it was like it had never been there. This was after the release of all the live hostages, and it was around the same time that they cleaned up Hostage Square in Tel Aviv, which is also kind of it became one of the centers of life in Tel Aviv. It's the plaza outside the Tel Aviv Art Museum, and it became Hostage Square, and it was full of art installations, and they would have hostage rallies there. And that day, they took it down and it disappeared, and it made me wonder, did this happen? Was this a nightmare that actually never happened? And that's why I referred to the last year as a year of vertigo. It's going to take us years and years to piece together what happened since October 7th. And that's assuming we're given some time to breathe, which I'm not sure is true.
Right now it's a question whether we will have some time to breathe. But you write that someone from the outside might have expected relief, maybe even joy by Israelis at the end of this year, but that's not what Israelis are feeling. And you write the feeling is unsettled. How do you understand that?
I've met people who've been to Israel in the past couple months thinking that they're going to meet happy Israelis, and because all the live hostages came home, which is not something that many of us expected would happen, certainly not as it happened. And the war in Gaza, which went on and on, seems to have been brought to some kind of conclusion that is at least acceptable to Israelis. It's certainly not the total victory that we were promised in the first weeks of the war, but you might expect Israelis to be happy, and people do not feel happy. They, as you know, they feel hungover. Maybe they're happier than they were, I guess, half a year ago, but it's not 100% clear that the war is over. We're still waiting for this attack, that may happen in Iran and then from Iran, and it could happen now, or it could never happen. And there's a lot of anger at the government for the fact that the war broke out and for the way it was handled. And there's been a real return to the divisive politics that were ripping the country apart before October 7th, and that, of course, is not great for the national mood. So I would say that the mood here is it is unsettled. People are quite battered. There wasn't a victory parade. It wasn't the end of the 6-day war. Israelis have really been through hell in the past 2.5 years. It's been horrific, and that's not a word that I use lightly. I've been in Israel for almost 31 years, and I've been through all kinds of things here, like the Second Intifada, but we've never experienced anything like we did over the past 2.5 years, and it's going to take a while for people to recover from it. And I think that the necessary condition for recovery is a different government that gives people the sense that it's the sense of a renewal of our political life and a very honest investigation of what led to this catastrophe, which the current government is preventing. So I think that those are conditions for national recovery. I think that if they happen, I think we will see Israelis bounce back because people here are incredibly resilient and they tend to love the country. And people who could walk through the past 2.5 years and come out the other side, they can get through a lot. People here are very, very impressive. I think actually a visitor to Israel who'd never been here before would not even notice necessarily that anything had happened. I mean, if you happen to walk on certain streets in Tel Aviv or Haifa or Rehovot, you might notice that the buildings look like Stalingrad. And then you're forced to confront the events of the past couple of years. But the bars are full, the restaurants are full, the beaches are, maybe not right now because it's cold, but the beaches are full in general. And, there are very few populations, certainly not in the West, that are as resilient as this one. So people are resilient, they're determined, but they're not happy.
Yeah, resilience really is the word. So this really leads me to the next question. Looking ahead, how do you see 2026 for Israel and for Israelis, election year?
Right. If it was impossible for me to sum up a year that already happened, I certainly can't predict a year that hasn't happened yet. And anything that I say will make me look very silly, obviously, because no one can predict what's going to happen. And we had an amazing illustration over the past 2.5 years of the way or the extent to which our history is not linear. I don't think anyone, looking at 2023 would have predicted the way that it ended. The main event that's supposed to happen here this year is an election. Whether that will be the main event of the year is a good question, and it depends, I guess, in large part on what happens in Iran. But there's supposed to be an election, and I think that the election, it's a cliche to say of an Israeli election that it is the most important election in the history of Israel, because people say that before every election.
It's always true, right?
It's always true. I don't think I've ever said it, to be honest. I maybe I said it once, but I believe it this time. I think that so much is riding on the results of this election, because people are so ragged and because people are just desperate for a change in leadership, and because so many Israelis are really hanging on, and they've hung on through the horrors of the past 2.5 years with the idea that this government was an aberration and not the rule. And I think that if the next election returns a result like the last election and we get a repeat of this kind of government, you're going to see something very deep break in Israeli society. And you're going to see a real spike in emigration, which we're already kind of seeing. For anyone following the numbers, the numbers are not catastrophic by any means, but they're not good. More people are leaving.
Brain drain, there is.
More people are. Yeah, there's a brain drain. I mean, anecdotally, I'm sure you know people, and I know people. Maybe people not saying that they're leaving, but people who are accepting very long fellowships and then not coming back, or people who are taking relocations to Palo Alto that they might not have taken before the war, and people who are kind of slipping away because the combination of psychopathic neighbors and incompetent and extreme governance is a very tough way to live. You can kind of deal with life in Israel as long as you have faith in your leaders and in the people keeping you safe. But nothing that happened over the past 2.5 years has really given us a lot of confidence in any of those institutions. And I think that many of us are expecting or hoping desperately that this is going to change this year. If it does change, I think that you're going to see an incredible release of energy in Israel that will carry the country forward. I mean, there's so much electricity in the country, and there's so many talented people, and there's so many committed people, and we have a population that it's really like nowhere else in the West. I mean, and I've lived in multiple countries, and I grew up in a country that's considered to be a very functional country, but no one has people like Israel has. So I think that if we have a better leadership, a lot of good things can happen. And I think that if we have a repeat of this leadership, which is the leadership responsible for the worst catastrophe in the history of the state, and a leadership that has resisted any attempt to investigate its own responsibility for that catastrophe, if we get a repeat of that this year, Israeli society is going to be broken in a very deep way. I don't want to say irreparable, but it's going to be broken in a very deep way.
So let's put current events on the side for a moment. As I was preparing for our conversation, I was thinking about your wonderful, wonderful book about Leonard Cohen and his journey to Israel during the Yom Kippur War, and his performances for soldiers at the front, and the inner journey that he went through. And it struck me how relevant the book feels after October 7th. I mean, on the one hand, it's a very very much a book about a singular figure, which is Leonard Cohen, but at the same time, it's also in a way about the relationship between like world Jewry and Israel. Do you feel the same regarding the relevance of the book today?
I think I wrote an entire book about the Yom Kippur War without understanding it. And I think I only understood the Yom Kippur War on October 7th. So I think that for me, I'm not saying that this war was useful as a learning experience for me, but it certainly taught me about the events that I'd already described. So that feeling of shock, on Yom Kippur 1973, Israel has an idea of what's going on. It has an idea of how strong it is, and everything collapses in a surprise attack on a Jewish holiday. And it happens 50 years and 1 day before October 7th, and everything collapses. And it feels like, there's no government and there's no army, and the citizens kind of rush to save the state. And the two wars are eerily similar. So I do feel that after October 7th, I could understand better what my own characters in that book about the 73 war felt. One difference, I think, between those events and the events that we've been living through over the past 2.5 years is that Leonard Cohen didn't show up this time, and no one of his stature did. And in fact, I'm not sure there is anyone of his stature in the world. So we had, this Jewish artist who felt strongly enough about the crisis, about this catastrophe happening in Israel, that he actually got on a plane and came here to be part of it. And it's one of the wildest moments in rock and roll history. Maybe in Jewish history, that might be a bit of a stretch, because let's face it, we've had our share of wild moments, but Cohen shows up in Israel without any plan. He's not planning to play for troops when he comes. He wants to pick grapefruits on a kibbutz. That's what he tells someone who he meets. And he meets an Israeli singer who says, no, man, you're Leonard Cohen. You're coming with us, and we're going to play for soldiers. And they get into this car. It's a Ford Falcon owned by Oshik Levy, who's a famous Israeli singer. And they go off and go off on one of the great rock tours of all time. And that moment is such a great one. First of all, Israelis remember it. It's part of Israeli mythology. Until I wrote the book, I think it wasn't exactly clear why he was here or how he got here or what exactly it was. But people remembered that at what was, I think, until October 7th, the darkest moment in Israel's history, Leonard Cohen came, and people never forgot it. And it's one of the reasons that Israelis to this day love Leonard Cohen, maybe more than any other people on earth, maybe even more than Canadians. Mm-hmm. And it's also this amazing meeting, as you said, between a great diaspora figure, maybe the great diaspora figure of the 20th century in some ways, a poet, a cosmopolitan, a man of art, and Israelis who are caught in a war and forced to fight. And there's an incredible photograph where Leonard Cohen is standing next to, two people actually who are of interest to us. One is Ariel Sharon, who is almost the embodiment of Israel, a man of violence, a general, this incredibly, forceful character, and Leonard Cohen, this poet from Montreal, and they're standing next to each other in Sinai. There's a concert in Sinai where you see Cohen and Sharon standing literally next to each other. The other person who, the other person standing exactly on the other side of Leonard Cohen, wearing a T-shirt is Matti Caspi, who is one of the greatest musicians in Israel's history, who accompanied Cohen on that tour, and who died this week. So another great, I guess, Jewish figure, kind of a Leonard Cohen. I guess Matti Caspi was what Leonard Cohen would have been had Leonard Cohen's parents moved to Israel, and instead of giving birth in Montreal.
But Matti, I want to ask you something, because American Jews showed up. I think that Israelis really saw it and were very moved by how diaspora Jews and particularly American Jews were there for us after October 7th and came over in delegations and participated, in doing mangals, barbecues for soldiers near the Gaza border. But there wasn't that Leonard Cohen. There wasn't the celebrity, okay? And we can't think about people who could have come, okay, like Spielberg or people like that. How do you understand that? Is that symbolic in any way? Does it have like a deeper meaning?
Yes, I think it does. I I guess we should give credit to Jerry Seinfeld. Seinfeld did show up, and he didn't tour the front and do comedy for soldiers. I'm not sure exactly how the soldiers would have responded to comedy at that particular moment. They were, I think, more in the mood for Leonard Cohen, like deep melancholy. That seemed to really work for soldiers in the Yom Kippur War. I'm not sure that comedy routines about nothing would have gone over too well with soldiers in Gaza. I might be wrong, but but no one of that stature showed up. And we can think about other artists who could have, or certainly other great Jewish figures who could have, theoretically, Dylan, Paul Simon, some of the great voices of that generation are still around, and they didn't. That's just the fact. Israel has become really radioactive for people on the Western left, and what was possible in 1973 for a famous artist like Leonard Cohen would be very tricky for an artist in 2026. By the way, even in 73, it was pretty tricky. It wasn't like everyone loved that Leonard Cohen came to the Yom Kippur War. It was not that everyone loved Israel at that time. And Leonard Cohen flies into some pretty thorny politics because of that visit, even in the early 70s. But now an artist coming to Israel would face real blowback, and there just don't seem to be a lot of people who have the courage to do it. And I think we have an example of either artists who believe the worst of Israel, so even after an incredible terror attack like the one we saw on October 7th, just didn't want to wade into the controversy. And we have a lot of people who are cowards.
Yeah, that's the bottom line. You have a new book coming out very soon in English and in Hebrew. Tell me all about it.
This book is called Out of the Sky. In Hebrew, it's called Lechapes Ben Adam, which is to look for a human being, which is a quote from a poem by Hannah Senesh, and it's about this crazy mission in 1944 where a group of young Jews who escaped the Holocaust and made it to what was then British Mandate Palestine, they agreed to parachute back into the Holocaust. And it's one of the founding myths of Israel. And the name that I mentioned, Hannah Senesh, is the most famous participant in that mission. She's a young woman who's 22 at the time that she jumps out of an airplane into occupied Yugoslavia. And she's famous here as a poet and as a famous kind of military heroine. So it's my personal attempt to go back to that mission and explore what it was, and to meet some of the incredible characters who took part in it and understand what they thought they were doing. It's a book that I started writing before this war, about a bit more than a year before the war, but it really took on new meaning once the war started, when the world outside, just as October 7th made it more possible for me to understand the Yom Kippur War, in some ways the atmosphere that we've seen after October 7th made it much easier to understand the 1940s. As dark as that sounds, I'm sure that many of us could not really understand what that felt like, what it felt like to live in a world with no good options. And obviously we're nowhere near the darkness of the 1940s, but I think we do have the feeling that the Jewish solutions that we thought were solid after the Second World War are not nearly as solid as we thought. And that's true of liberal democracy in the West, which was one Jewish solution for people in the diaspora, and the state of Israel, which was the Zionist solution, which I think we assumed was relatively safe. And then we had to watch pictures from October 7th that looked like pictures from the 1930s, looked like Kishinev in 1903. The Cossacks are rampaging through the village and raping women and kidnapping children. And the solutions that we thought were solutions are clearly not solutions. And that helped me enter the headspace of these characters who face this world where there seem to be no good options, and everything is really dark, and there's no Jewish state, and they want there to be one, but I don't think they necessarily expect that to happen in the near future. And the entire continent of Europe is occupied, and Jews are being murdered, and their homes in Europe have been consumed. And what does one do in those circumstances? And their answer was, what you do is an act of incredible heroism against all odds. And just thinking about that, I think, is helpful at this moment.
It certainly is. Though I wonder what initially drew you to write specifically about this story, because so much has been written about Hannah Senesh, right? As you mentioned, she's a national symbol, and that can be intimidating for a writer.
Sure. I mean, part of the draw is that mythological character of Hannah Senesh. Hannah Senesh, for listeners who might not be 100% familiar with her, every Israeli knows Hannah Senesh. She's as famous in Israel as like Judah the Maccabee, or, my kids came home a couple of years ago with a deck of Israeli playing cards like patriotic playing cards. And there's a set of 4 national heroes, and it's Theodore Herzl, Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, and Hannah Senesh. She's that famous. There's dolls. I actually have one here on my shelf. There are dolls of Hannah Senesh, like figurines of Hannah Senesh in a military tunic, saluting. And she's this incredibly famous figure. But if you talk to people about her, no one knows anything about her. I mean, she's kind of, for Americans, she's kind of like Davy Crockett or George Washington, where you have this very two-dimensional idea of who this person was. But she was a much more interesting character than she's given credit for. And I think that because she became a Zionist heroine in a very two-dimensional way, people really haven't wanted to touch that story because it's, it's almost embarrassing. Like Hannah Senesh is kind of a stand-in for embarrassing ideology of the 1950s, but that's not really what she was. That's what she was made into by the founders of the state, because we needed heroes, and she was an incredible figure to be transformed into a hero. But she was something much more interesting. She's a Hungarian girl. She's a bookworm. She's the daughter of a really well-known playwright and novelist in Budapest, which is something that is kind of edited out of her biography because she needs to become the ultimate Zionist pioneer. But she's really a kid. She's like a theater kid. And she thinks a lot about stories, and she's read an incredible number of books. And that has a lot to do with why she undertakes this mission, and has a lot to do with the way I see the mission, which is less as a military mission than almost as a literary mission. And that's true of Hannah, and it's true of the other characters who are much less famous than Hannah, even though their names are also known to Israelis. For example, Enzo Sereni, who's he's an Italian. He has a kibbutz named after him, Netzer Sereni. So a lot of these people live on in the landscape in Israel. Hannah has a kibbutz named after her called Yad Hannah. And there's another character in the story whose name is Chaviva Reich, who is another one of the parachutists, and she has a kibbutz named after her called Lehavot Chaviva. And there's another of the parachutists named Abba Berdichev, and he has a community named after him. It's called Alone Abba. So even if you just drive around Israel, you're seeing kind of coded references to this mission in 1944, and I thought it would be worthwhile to try to figure out what actually happened and what it means.
And it's worthwhile to pre-order the book. So we're going to put links here so people could pre-order them, and links to all of the other articles and books that we talked about in this great conversation. We've reached the final part of our episode, the Jewish Crossroads questionnaire. 5 quick and fun questions. Are you ready, Matti?
Absolutely.
What's your earliest Jewish memory?
My earliest Jewish memory, I guess all my memories are Jewish. I'm trying to think of my earliest non-Jewish memory. I guess I have a very strong memory of the Seder. Like I really remember, I was just thinking of this the other day because I was cutting parsley. And there's something about the smell of parsley that just reminds me of the Seder, and it's very, very old. So I don't know if eating parsley dipped in salt water is my first Jewish memory, but it must be.
One of them. If you could meet any Jewish figure from history, ancient or modern, who would it be and why?
It would absolutely be Theodor Herzl, who, as we've said, is a mutual friend of ours. I would love to talk to Herzl about how he understood what he understood, and I would also love to ask him what he thinks about the country that that was founded as a result of his actions.
Call me to that conversation. I would want to be a listener. What is your favorite or most meaningful Jewish tradition?
I think that for me, the most meaningful one is Shabbat, which I do every week. And the act of withdrawing from the world, turning off your devices, has never been more important than it is now that we're, being constantly, our attention is constantly being invaded by electronics of different kinds. So the idea of taking a day where you are just at home with the family and not kind of at the mercy of the forces that are constantly preying on our attention through our devices, I think that's very valuable, setting aside any religious reasons or ideological reasons. Shabbat is probably the Jewish tradition that I most appreciate.
If you could jump 100 years into the future in one sentence only, what would you hope to see for the Jewish people?
I mean, what I would hope to see is peace. It's a word that has kind of gone out of fashion, certainly here in Israel. The word shalom used to be one on bumper stickers that you would see on half the cars on the street, and it's become almost a stand-in for naivete and for, unrealistic hopes. People have really stopped using the word peace or shalom, but that is the thing we need more than anything else. So let's hope that we have it in 100 years or maybe even less.
Hopefully. What's one Jewish word? It can be, Hebrew, English, Yiddish, Canadian slang that feels particularly meaningful to you right now.
The word that I keep thinking about, just because we're in an election year and because of the divisive nature of our discourse here, the word that I find myself using most is achdut, which is unity. And it's something that the Jewish people have never had, almost by definition. And if you look at the history, certainly of Israel and Zionism, the early Zionist congresses, everyone's fighting with each other and they're constantly walking out. And then you look back at, Josephus, who's describing that the Romans are besieging Jerusalem in, 70 CE, and the Jews inside Jerusalem are just fighting with each other. They're not even fighting the Romans; they're fighting with each other. So it's a very scarce resource, I think, in the life of the Jewish people, and maybe that's the reason that I think it's so important. When I look around the society, and maybe as someone who's a bit of an outsider, I see so much that connects people. I don't think that people actually disagree on that many things that are important. And yet people are convinced that they do, and that these things are extremely important, and they actually might be so important that they're willing to sacrifice the state in order to defeat their internal political enemies. So, shalom is our wish for the next century, but my wish for the next year is some kind of achdut, some kind of unity that will allow us to rebuild and move on to something better.
Matti Friedman, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Tamar.
Well, that's it for this episode of Jewish Crossroads. We'd love to hear from you. Write to us at jewishcrossroadspod@gmail.com. Hit follow on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcast. And if you enjoyed the conversation, please rate us. It helps us reach new listeners. Thank you to Samuel Hyde, Noah Slepkov, and Tomer Ratzabi Bar for recording, editing, and assisting in producing this episode. We'll meet again, same place, same journey, with a new voice. See you soon.